he changed his mind. And we know why he changed his mind. He was in the town of Whitby in northeastern England that summer, and while he was there, he went to the local library and he found a book entitled An Account of the Principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia. And the book was written by William.
In the Kirillo-Belozerski Monastery lies a manuscript of the same name. The first lines of this manuscript state, "There lived in the Wallachian lands a Christian prince of the Greek faith who was called Dracula in the Wallachian language, which means devil in our language." Many have mistakenly translated this passage and mixed the statements claiming the definition of the word Dracula meant evil instead of its original meaning of honor in the Wallachian language.
Now, in this book, Wilkinson devotes 2 paragraphs to a 15th century voivode named Dracula, who, as Wilkinson writes, crossed the Danube and fought against the Turks. Now that's all that was in Wilkinson's book about this Dracula, except for a footnote. After the name Dracula, there was a footnote which stated, "Dracula in the Wallachian language means the devil." Now it mightn't be accurate, but that's what Stoker found in this book. And Stoker copied that footnote verbatim into his notes. Dracula means the devil. And that is precisely why he decided to use the name. He didn't know anything else about Vlad. He didn't know his name was Vlad. The name Vlad does not appear in Wilkinson's book. It does not appear in Stoker's notes. And most important, it does not appear in the novel Dracula. Most people today associate impalement with Vlad because the nickname Vlad the Impaler. I mean, that draws attention to it. And many people assume that he invented it as a particularly cruel method of punishment. Well, he didn't.
The use of impalement was used by many other rulers before Vlad's time, during his rule in other kingdoms, and even after his death. During the reign of Vlad Dracula, Vlad's father, Dracula wrote to Brashov many times asking for peace. And in one of the many occurrences, Vlad's father asked why his men were not given a fair trial before Brashov leaders skinned his merchants alive on a pole.
He might have observed it in Turkey, but that's another common misconception, that it was something, a habit he picked up from his years as a hostage in Turkey when he was a young boy. Now, the Turks may have impaled people too, but that's not where it originated.
In the Battle of Constantinople in 1453, Sultan Mehmed captured and impaled sailors who tried to pass through the Bosphorus. Mehmed placed these impaled sailors on the opposite side of the river in Constantinople to strike fear in the citizens who were defending their city, stating that this is what would happen to those who helped defend the city. Stefan Selmar, canonized as the athlete of Christ, impaled many of his enemies. As noted in Moldavian history, he impaled the disobedient boyars and the Turks in all directions, crosswise, and even one on top of the other.
A Romanian historian in recent years has come up with a very probable explanation that actually he picked it up from the Brashov merchants themselves, and that this method had been used in Transylvania earlier by the Saxons, and that Vlad saw a type of delicious irony in this. You know, you've been using this against my people, so you'll get a taste of your own punishments. And that the impalement was just Vlad's way of saying, well, I'm going to execute you, but I'll do you the favor of executing you by your favorite method, impalement.
In the times of Murad II, Mehmed's father would feast upon the dead bodies of his enemies, especially if he had won a battle. He did this after the Battle of Varna. He would first clear all of his men that had fallen and bury them. Then a feast would be prepared and they would dine over the bodies of the enemies, even if they were still alive. Mehmed II's favorite form of torture was sawing men in half. He did this to Matthias's uncle Zizlagi. Many other punishments by other ruling kingdoms continued, such as burning at the stake for crimes of rape, forgers of money, and killing of relatives. This was used in Fagarash and was made law in 1508. Vlad was familiar with many of the surrounding laws in each kingdom, and he used their form of punishment when they committed crimes against him.
How cruel, we're raising the question of how much exaggeration was in some of the reports that circulated about him. What other rulers? Oh, almost all rulers of that time were cruel. We just happen to know more about Vlad's cruelty because his name is Dracula. And it's because of the interest in Dracula and he's even more cruel than the Dracula in Bram Stoker's novel. You know, there's a sensationalism attached to the name Dracula that then rubs off on him. So, but I wouldn't say he was any more cruel. All you have to do is look at the kings of England in the 15th century. They were cruel. I mean, look what some of them did to their subjects and to the people who dared to oppose them. You know, look at the rulers in other parts of Europe at the time. I mean, look at Stephen the Great himself. I mean, he was cruel. All these rulers were cruel. Otherwise, they would never have survived. Now, that doesn't make it right. I'm not arguing the morality of it, but I'm just stating that in terms of cruelty, to single out Vlad as being, you know, the worst of the worst, I mean, he's nothing compared to Ivan the Terrible. But to single him out as the worst, you know, it's a little bit over the top.
There are many letters that give detailed information about the relationship between the Transylvanian towns and Vlad Dracula. In one of the many letters to Brashov, Vlad states,
I sent our man Dimitru to you, who has purchased some steel, and he bought it fairly. But you have not allowed him to bring back this steel to us, and you still have this merchandise in your possession. Therefore, I am asking that you return to us the steel purchased or return the money that was paid for it. One of these two must be returned, for these damages cannot be accepted.
In March of 1457, Vlad wrote to the Transylvanian town of Sibiu and stated,
Please remember the agreements between us. From our side, there was no violence from the beginning.
Vlad Dracula had a half-brother named Vlad Kalugorol, or Vlad the Monk. This monk was claiming himself as ruler, and so Vlad Dracula informed Sibiu that this man is not the ruling prince. Vlad Dracula also tells us in this letter that from the beginning of his reign, he did not start the hostilities with the Transylvanian town. He asked them to keep to the agreements, and if they would not be peaceful, he would have no choice but to begin hostilities against them. We find out later, Sibiu did not take heed of Vlad's warning. In a letter from Vlad in the spring of 1458, Vlad asked them to not harbor a boyar named Mihail Logofat, and also a man named Party. Vlad continued in this letter that he had forgiven all the boyars except for these two men. He asked that Sibiu should banish them from their city. This letter also brings into light that Vlad stated he forgave all his council of boyars, except for these two. In March of 1458, both the Hungarian king Matthias Corvinus and Mihail Szislagyi, the king's uncle, had heard about the confrontations between the Transylvanian towns and the prince. The Hungarian king tried to maintain good relations with the Wallachian prince, and wrote to Sibiu on his behalf.
We understand how you wrongly moved against the illustrious Prince Vlad, and this you have caused a great deal of trouble, of which the losses that have befallen you cannot be blamed on him. As a prince he has allowed you peace, so you should allow him the same. If you tamper with this peace, you will not be given protection by this kingdom when he comes against you.
Mihail Szislagyi wrote, Shortly after Vlad's brother Radu took the throne, we find a document that he had written to the counselors of Brashov. It is an important letter that gives us an understanding of what Vlad Dracula had to deal with during his reign as prince. Radu writes,
Your merchants have come to my country on many occasions, and I have let you go about freely and make profits throughout my country. But as you well know, you still have money that belongs to my merchants. The amount of 15,500 florins is still owed to them. You have paid only 4,000 in the time of my brother, Voivode Vlad, but the rest of you were to pay in 1 year, in 3 installments. Things have occurred as they have, but in the midst of all this change, you remained quiet.
Not only did Brashov owe Vlad Dracula money and had not paid him during his reign as they had promised, but in another letter to Brashov, Radu begins to have the same problems Vlad had been dealing with during his reign. In the summer of 1470, Radu writes,
We have never started the conflicts with you. You have always begun them. My merchants go there with their wealth, and you take this from them along with their profits, harming them and not allowing them to go freely in your midst. Therefore, I will do the same to your men.
Many ruling princes, not just from Wallachia but also from Moldavia, continued to have turbulence with the German Saxon-run towns of Sibiu and Brasov. This disruption in the economy of many kingdoms began before Vlad's reign and would continue until long after his death. The notoriety that the German Saxons would give Dracula would never give the truthful encounters that the Wallachian prince had with these towns.
Most of what we know about Vlad comes from a series of pamphlets that appeared in the 1480s and 1490s. Now, these were printed pamphlets, which is very significant because the printing press had only just recently been invented, and these were some of the earliest documents to come off the Gutenberg printing presses. And they were stories, narratives about Vlad that had been composed by the Germans in Transylvania, the Saxons. Now, if one just remembers and recalls the trouble that Vlad had had with the Brasov Saxons, then one would hardly expect these to be very reliable, and they weren't. The very first documents about Vlad were actually manuscripts before the printing presses started producing the Saxon pamphlets. And there was an original manuscript that was lost. There are 4 copies of it exist. One of them is called the St. Gall or St. Gallen manuscript, named after the monastery where the manuscript is presently located. And that manuscript was very much like the Saxon stories that most of us are familiar with, about the dreadful cruelties and so on. In fact, the Saxon pamphlets were based to a very great extent on this manuscript.
After the arrest of Vlad Dracula in 1462, forged documents were made and the propaganda against Vlad Dracula began. The manuscripts and poems were just the beginning of this propaganda smear campaign against him.
So they played a very important role. And the pamphleteers, of course, were only too glad, just like the modern newspapers who want to sell their newspapers. They're only too glad to keep rolling these off the presses. And the writer of these various writers of these manuscripts and pamphlets were very biased against Vlad. So again, the St. Gallen manuscript does not give you a very objective, it doesn't pretend to be objective, it's very negative. But it's most important to us today because it, in turn, was used as the major influence in a poem, very well-known poem, by a German poet named Michael Beheim, that was based to a very great extent on these earlier manuscripts.
Yes, and there was a story written of Dracula,
okay.
And it was very important for Vienna because this single leaf was not in Latin, because Thomas Ebendorfer was the first who transferred it from I don't know which language into Latin and brought it to the chronicle literature. And after him, a lot of chronicles inserted this story of Dracula in explicit.
We don't hardly hear anything about this. So he first gave it to Emperor Frederick.
Yes.
And then after he gave his manuscript to Emperor Frederick, then he continued to work on it, and then he wrote the Dracula story in it. Yeah. So it's an addition.
It's an addition, that's it.
So
he died, Thomas Ebendorfer died in 1464.
Okay.
And the last inscription in our manuscript is 1463.
Thomas Ebendorfer had a high position in the Austrian courts under Emperor Frederick III. Before his death in 1464, Ebendorfer began writing stories about Vlad Dracula. At this time, there was also a man in the services of the emperor. His name was Mihail Beheim.
A few years ago, I decided to do a little bit of research on this Beheim because the stuff he said about Vlad was so dreadful. I mean, I was curious about where it had all come from. So I found a German scholar in the United States, and the two of us worked together. He worked more on Beheim as a singer at court, and all the implications of that, because his poetry was actually sung. So this early story about Dracula, and he was referred to as Dracula in the poem, was actually sung at the court of the Holy Roman Emperor. And the poem was about 1,000 lines long, and it basically took the stories from the St. Gallen manuscripts, and added to them a first-person account by a German Catholic monk who had been in Transylvania and had met Vlad and had experienced his wrath. I expect that he felt that he needed to get out of Transylvania because he was terrified of Vlad. And so, again, we have to take anything he writes with a grain of salt, because he was probably overreacting to his experiences and the stories that he had heard about Vlad. Plus, he probably, when he got to the emperor's court, wasn't averse to exaggerating and making this even into a more dramatic story than it really was.
But it continues what's inside. But he gives very exactly the places where these things happened, and the people who were involved in this cruise. Yeah. So we have the impression it's true, but we know that the information he has was second-hand information. Yes, and it was propaganda, for example.
Definitely.
Yeah.
There were portraits that were painted of Vlad that put him in the most precarious positions. These included such propagandist portraits of Dracula being portrayed as Pontius Pilate, as found in the Gallery of Narodnia in Slovenia. Another painting, titled The Crucifixion of Christ, which is located in the Maria am Gestad Church in Vienna, showed Vlad on the side of the heathens that were looking away from Christ. These paintings were all completed in the years 1462 through 1464. These were obvious exaggerations because, of course, none of these pictures could have ever taken place. But because of the many people who could not read, they spread the word in many stories that Vlad Dracula was truly evil. These portraits and pamphlets became the masters of negative propaganda against Dracula and spread like wildfire all across Europe over the centuries. The noble efforts of Dracula were crushed, and the name Dracula was associated with evil instead of its original meaning of high honor. Just a short distance from Maria am Gestad Church in Vienna is the Belvedere Museum. Here's another portrait of Vlad titled Martyrdom of St. Andrew. Here's Vlad dressed as a Turk. There were many errors in translations. Church Slavonic was Vlad's dialect, and many words were translated with errors. There were also historians who had their own agendas to mix facts with fiction, creating their own interpretation of many stories.
Now, anyone that undertakes to translate a historical document has to be very, very careful, because translation, and it doesn't matter if it's a document about Vlad or a document about anybody, the very process of translation sometimes changes meaning, and sometimes little nuances of meaning are altered because of the way a person chooses to translate. Everybody knows that. I mean, that happens to anyone. But in the case of the Beheim poem, a couple of historians translated it with considerable liberties. There's a little section in the Beheim poem that talks about Vlad sitting down at the table to have a meal and washing his hands in the blood of some of the victims that have been impaled. Now that, taken like that, is like a kind of reminds one of Pontius Pilate, and was probably intended as, well, I'm washing my hands